はい、それでは定刻となりましたので、ただいまより生物多様性の経済学、ダスグプタレビューに関する懇談会を開始いたします。進行を務めます、経団連自然保護協議会事務局長の長谷川でございます。本日はよろしくお願いいたします。本日のウェビナーは、英国大使館との共催で開催いたします。日英同時通訳で行いますので、通訳機能をご利用される皆様は、お手元のウェビナー画面の下の方に表示されております通訳ボタンで言語を選択していただければと思います。また、本日はプレスオープン、かつ後日会合の模様を動画で YouTube に掲載する予定です。よろしくお含みおきいただければと思います。本日のスケジュールでございますけれども、ご挨拶させていただいた後、英国財務省からダスグプタレビューの概要についてご説明いただきます。その後、ダスグプタ名誉教授ご本人との懇談というような形になります。それでは早速でございますが、経団連自然保護協議会の会長の二宮からご挨拶を申し上げます。二宮会長、よろしくお願いいたします。
はい、経団連自然保護協議会会長の二宮です。開会にあたり一言ご挨拶を申し上げます。本日はケンブリッジ大学のダスグプタ名誉教授、英国財務省の皆様、慶応大学の大沼教授、そして環境省の奥田局長におかれましては、大変ご多忙の中、懇談会にご出席をいただきまして、心より感謝を申し上げます。また、共催者であるロングボトム大使をはじめ、英国大使館の皆様には開催にあたり、種々ご尽力いただき、ありがとうございました。そして本日オンラインで参加をしていただいている多数の方々にも御礼を申し上げたいと思います。経団連自然保護協議会は、リオの地球サミットが開催された1992年に設立されました。経団連地球環境検証を実践することを目的とし、同時に設置されました経団連自然保護基金を経由し、国内外の NGO の生物多様性の保全や自然保護活動を支援しています。会員106社をはじめ、多くの方々のご協力により、これまでの28年間の累計で1572件、約44億円の支援を行うことができました。加えて、協議会では、会員に対する勉強会やフォーラムの開催など、啓発活動も実施しています。昨年6月に公表いたしました経団連生物多様性宣言イニシアチブのウェブ版を先月開設し、経団連生物多様性宣言に賛同する251企業団体と126の取り組みが事例集として紹介されています。このように我が国でも生物多様性への関心が大きく高まっていますが、課題も浮き上がってきています。それは生物多様性の保全をどのように計測をし、その改善に向けた取り組みをどう事業活動や政策に取り込んでいくかということです。この点、気候変動では、例えば大気中の CO2 濃度や 1.5 度といった明確な指標がありますが、生物多様性では今のところそういったものがありません。こうした中、本日の主題であるダスグプタレビューでは、市場価格に自然資本の価格も価値も加味した会計価格や GDP に代わるものとして包括的な富の概念が提示されています。また、トランスフォーマティブチェンジの必要性も提言されています。こうした概念や提言は、我々日本企業にとって大変大きな示唆になるものと期待をしています。本日は会員企業はもとより、多数の非会員の方々にも参加をいただいています。経団連自然保護協議会では、ポスト愛知の国際枠組みや、情報開示に関する TNFD などにも着目をし、本日のようなイベントを適宜 開催してまいります。本日の会合がご参加の皆様方にとって有益になることを記念をいたしまして、私の挨拶とさせていただきます。ありがとうございました。
二宮会長、ありがとうございました。それでは、駐日英国大使のジュリア・ロングボトム様からご挨拶いただきます。ロングボトム大使、よろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you, Chairman Futamia, for your opening remarks, and thank you to the Keidanren for hosting this event with us on such an important issue. I'm delighted to see that so many people are joining today and very much welcome the Keidanren's action to engage with Japanese business on something the UK has been working hard to improve and resolve. It's great to see so many people participating today, including from Japan, but I apologize as we have speakers from the UK as well. I'm going to speak in English today. We've all seen the statistics, and we know that nature is declining at a catastrophic and unprecedented rate. In just the last 50 years, the planet's wildlife populations have plummeted by 68%. We know this is caused largely by our unsustainable relationship with nature, and it's accelerated by climate change. The British government and our Prime Minister are committed to delivering a nature-positive future, in which we leave the environment in a better state than we found it, and we reverse biodiversity loss globally by 2030. We've committed, along with the Global Ocean Alliance and the High Ambition Coalition, to protect at least 30% of our land and global oceans by 2030. We're working with our partners to build support for this target ahead of the Convention on Biological Diversity Conference of Parties in Kunming next week. We've also earmarked at least £3 billion of our international climate finance over 5 years to nature-based solutions to help restore and protect nature and biodiversity domestically as we mainstream nature into economic and financial decision-making in our public institutions. As part of this effort, the British government commissioned the Dassgupta Review, which we will hear more about today, is the first global assessment of its kind into the economics of biodiversity loss. The review highlights just how urgently we need to take action. I'd like to encourage you to consider taking forward both the review's approaches to economic decision-making and its recommendations for reforming our institutions, businesses, and systems to value nature more. To mainstream nature into our economic and financial decision-making in our public institutions. I hope the webinar today provides you with information and insight into the possibilities and ways in which businesses can make a significant, positive impact to the future of biodiversity issues. And I hope you all have a chance to consider what difference you can make to protecting the world we live in through your work. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing our distinguished speakers today. Thank you.
ロングボトム大使、ありがとうございました。それでは本日ご来賓の環境省自然環境局、奥田直久様からご挨拶いただきます。奥田局長、よろしくお願いいたします。
はい、ただいまご紹介に預かりました環境省自然環境局長の奥田でございます。経団連自然保護協議会二宮会長、そして駐日英国大使館ジュリア・ロングボトム大使、本日はこうした素晴らしい会をですね、ホストしていただき、また私をお招きいただき、誠にありがとうございます。また、遠く英国の地からダスグプタ教授にもご参加いただいていることを、非常にありがたく思っております。開会にあたりまして、一言ご挨拶を申し上げたいと思います。いよいよ来週から中国昆明で生物多様性条約 COP15 の第1部が開催されます。新たな世界目標であるポスト2020 生物多様性の枠組みの検討が進められている時期に、気候変動の経済的側面にスポットを当てたスターンレビューをまとめた帰国がですね、生物多様性と経済の報告書であるダスグプタレビューを公表したことには、私は大きな意味があると感銘を受けております。このレビューは G7 の成果にもですね、影響を与えたものと承知しております。帰国及びダスグプタ教授の環境と経済に関する先進的な知見と努力に対して心より敬意を表したいと思います。遡ると2010年、我が国は COP10 で愛知目標を議長国として取りまとめました。そしてそれに基づき国内計画を策定し、陸域、海域における保護地域の拡大を図ってまいりました。またさらに国際的には、里山イニシアチブなどによって途上国を含めた国際貢献を行ってきたものと自負しております。そして今般、英国の尽力もあってですね、G7 で、合意した、またポスト2020バイオダイバーシティフレームワークの中でもですね、主要なターゲットになるであろう2030年に 30% を保全するという目標、30 by 30、これについては極めて重要なイニシアチブであると考えておりまして、先日、前の環境大臣である小泉大臣から、その達成に向けた基本コンセプトを発表させていただいたところでございます。今後、この30 by 30を達成するために具体的な道筋、これを定めて、30 by 30ロードマップとしてですね、COP15 のパート2の時期までに公表する予定でございます。この30 by 30の達成に向けては、保護地域のみならず、民間企業も含めたあらゆるステークホルダーが中心となって保全活動に取り組む、いわゆる OECM、生物、Other Effective Area Based Conservation Measures、これを設定していくことが重要だと考えております。OECM における保全活動が適切に評価され、民間企業等の成長につながるような仕組みを検討することは重要です。その観点からも、ダスグプタレビューには様々な示唆をいただいているものと認識しております。一方、すでに我が国では経団連と協力して、マルチステークホルダーの団体である国連生物多様性の10年日本委員会、いわゆる UNDBJ と呼ばれる組織を作って、世界の生物多様性保全に向けた日本の取り組み、技術などを紹介してきました。こうした経済界との連携、協力というのは、様々な形で行われており、この10年で進んできたものと承知しております。そして昨年11月には、経団連と環境省で生物多様性ビジネス貢献プロジェクトを立ち上げさせていただきました。これは日本企業の持つポスト2020バイオダイバーシティフレームワークに貢献する技術、製品、サービスの事例を整理したものでございます。近日中にウェブサイトを立ち上げ、プロモーション動画とともに公開する予定としております。ぜひご覧いただきたいと思います。今後も経済界と協力して、先ほど申し上げた30 by 30の達成、もしくは経済活動全体でのサプライチェーン、それを全体として見た生物多様性の負荷軽減、そういったことを行っていきたいと考えております。最後となりましたが、本日のウェビナーが関係者の議論のもと、有意義な 会となって、生物多様性の主流化に向けた具体的な一歩につながることを記念して、私からのご挨拶とさせていただきます。ありがとうございました。
奥田局長、どうもありがとうございました。それでは続きまして、英国財務省のヘザー・ブリットン様より、ダスグプタレビューの概要についてご説明いただきます。ブリットン様は、ダスグプタ名誉教授にレビューを委託した英国財務省のダスグプタレビューオフィスのメンバーで、レビューの発刊後はその普及に取り組まれております。それでは、ブリットン様、よろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you for your kind introduction. I have had the privilege of working with Professor Dass Gupta over the past year and have supported his participation in a huge variety of events and interviews since the review's publication to help its dissemination. So I hope he doesn't mind me giving a brief introduction to both the review, which was published in February this year, and the formal government response, before we turn to this discussion between Professor Dass Gupta and Professor Ayumi Onuma in a few moments. As you're about to hear, the economic consequences of biodiversity loss are often misunderstood or overlooked. And it is for that reason that the UK Treasury commissioned Professor Sapatha Dass Gupta to write his global, independent review on the economics of biodiversity. The review is powerful because it is grounded in a deep understanding of ecology and earth sciences and how they are affected by economic activity. The review explores the sustainability of humanity's engagements with nature and provides a comprehensive framework for thinking about biodiversity in the context of our economies. The review makes clear that a fundamental change in how we think about and approach economics is urgently needed if we are to reverse biodiversity loss and protect and enhance our prosperity. The UK government formally responded to the review in June, making commitments including ensuring all new UK bilateral aid spending does no harm to nature, and legislating in England for all nationally significant infrastructure projects to have a net positive impact on biodiversity. And that is not the last word on the review. It will continue to be used to inform government policies in the UK and, we hope, internationally. But I will stop there and allow Professor Dass Gupta himself to explain his review's findings in more detail. Thank you.
ブリットン様、どうもありがとうございました。それではここからはダスグプタ名誉教授との懇談となります。本日は慶応大学の大沼あゆみ先生にファシリテーター役となっていただき、事前に参加者からいただいた質問も含めながら対話を進めていきます。ダスグプタ名誉教授、大沼教授、よろしくお願いいたします。
Hello, Professor Dass Gupta. Thank you very much for joining us. Today, I'm very honored to be interviewing you again, following my role as an interviewer for your Blue Planet Prize lecture 6 years ago. Yes. Very nice to meet you again. Yes. Your review is gaining growing attention in Japan. For example, the day before yesterday, Sunday, one of Japan's top newspapers, the Asahi Shimbun, featured it very extensively. Also, it's used in the place of education. In fact, I've been using it in my university seminar since April, and the students have been reporting on it every week. They are being impressed very much, yes. Many business persons here on Zoom today are looking forward to hearing from Professor Dass Gupta. Yes. On behalf of them, I'd like to ask you as many questions as time permits. Yes. So please allow me to ask a question in Japanese from here. それでは、 ダスグプタ教授にですね、これからいただいた質問を含めまして、さまざまなダスグプタレビューに関するですね、内容についての質問をさせていただきたいと思います。まずですね、ダスグプタレビューでは生物多様性の損失について、前半部分で非常に詳しく、お書きになっています。で、まずですね、生物多様性というのはどういう危機をもたらしているのでしょうか。また、その危機に対してですね、ダスグプタレビューはエコノミクス・オブ・バイオダイバーシティとありますように、経済学からアプローチしています。こういった危機に経済学からアプローチする意義というものは、どういうものなのかということをですね、お話しいただければと思います。
Thank you very much, and it is a great pleasure to meet you again. As you say, 6 years or so. First of all, in regard to your question, first of all, although the title of the review is The Economics of Biodiversity, I found it, on reflection and reading the ecological sciences, earth sciences, that the review really ought to be about the biosphere, of which biodiversity is a characteristic. Right? So, and of course, there are many ways of thinking about biodiversity, many ways of measuring it. It's not a unique, it's not a head count of species only. It is many other functional biodiversity is important of ecosystems. Now, the reason it was useful to move away from biodiversity per se as a symptom of the health of ecosystems is that I could concentrate on ecosystems as constituents of the biosphere and place the biosphere as a capital asset in which we are embedded. The human economy is embedded. And my task, my job was to study ecosystems as capital assets, which we can degrade if we overuse it, and identify reasons as to why we might be tempted to overuse it, and in fact, end up overusing it. And that's basically the broad background. And the idea was to bring ecosystems on a par with physical capital of the kind that we manufacture, like furniture, roads, buildings, and so forth, and human capital. Human capital and produced capital, if you like, are the two types of capital assets that economists study, in particular in terms of estimating long-term growth possibilities, economic possibilities. And what is missing are natural capital, that is to say, all the machinery out there, nature's machinery out there, which is churning out goods and services, which we then use. So that's the first point. The second point, to answer your question very directly, we are in a terrible state at the moment. There's no ifs and buts about it. People mention it, and my task was, in the review, was to give a detailed empirical picture of how far we have gone into our overshooting for the demands that we make on nature and nature's capacity to respond and supply it on a sustainable basis. So what's currently going on is that we are taking more out of nature than she's able to replenish. And the way that can happen is that nature diminishes in productivity. So that's the story. I wanted to place the economics of biodiversity, see it as an asset management problem, not only at the level of national governments, but also international sphere and down to the level of the household, which is one reason the review is very long, 600 pages. But I have prepared a 100-page briefer summary for the average citizen, if you like, who does not wish to look into the mathematical structure of the problem. I hope that's a reasonable synopsis of the motivation of my review.
はい、非常によく分かりました。ありがとうございます。自然をですね、我々の資産として扱うということの重要性というのが強調されているということが、非常によく理解できると思います。 それでは、次の質問に、移っていきたいと思います。まず我々の、社会でですね、大きな環境問題の一つというのは気候変動の問題です。で、気候変動の問題というのが非常に我々にとって分かりやすいのは、それはカーボンの問題であって、したがって政策目標というのは基本的には地球全体でのカーボンの排出量を減らすという非常にシンプルなものになりやすいわけですね。ところがですね、生物多様性というのはさまざまな生態系とかさまざまな種の構成体ですし、それからそれはグローバルに存在するというよりもローカルに存在するものです。そうするとこの生物多様性というものはでは守っていこうというときに気候変動のカーボンのようなですね、目標となるような生物多様性を評価する指標のようなものはあるのでしょうか。
Thank you very much. A very, very good question. It's a deep question. Okay, I'm going to start right from the beginning with the first part about climate change. Climate change or climate regulation that nature provides is only one of the many, many services that nature provides us with. Of course, nature wasn't designed to provide it for us. We have evolved in a world in which nature operates. We're just part of nature, okay? So that has to be recognized. Biodiversity is only one, the climate change is only one of them. And you're right to point out that there is a simple metric, or at least we think there is a simple metric of carbon emission. But actually, it's not so much carbon emission, it's carbon concentration in the atmosphere, which is a stock. Now, think of this way, that we should think of the atmosphere as a capital good, capital asset, into which which is used as a sink for our emissions. The moment you do that, the economics of climate change becomes a part of the economics of biodiversity in the way I described it, because it's concerned with maintaining the health of a particular asset, namely the atmosphere, as a repository of our waste. Okay? The problem is that climate regulation is only one among many other services Mother Nature offers us. And one of the weaknesses of the received economics of climate change has been that it has isolated climate regulation as a service that nature provides us from all the other services that Mother Nature provides us. For example, nitrogen fixation, for example, decomposition of waste, for example, pollination, and so forth. Now, the problem with these services that I've just now enumerated is that they're complementary to one another. The processes that are leading nature to offer us these services are complementary. They're not substitutes and they're not independent, which means if you put too much pressure on any one of them, the others start crumbling down as well, which is why the review studies the biosphere as a whole and then breaks up into components. The second point to mention is that biodiversity, the economics of biodiversity is not a local problem only. Think of the oceans, the open oceans. They are a global public good. Without the oceans, we are all dead. The human economy will just not only not survive, it will be crushed. And yet it's an open access resource. We don't pay for its use. We can fish without paying any rent for it. We can ship goods across the Pacific Atlantic without paying any rent for it, for the no traffic charges. And so, of course, we overuse it. So these are global public goods. These are global problems. But of course, they're also local, as you rightly point out, for local ecosystems at the household level. So is there a single metric? The answer is no, there isn't a single metric, but there isn't a single metric even for distinction between a manufacturing sector of an economy and the agricultural sector of an economy. We break up the economy in traditional economics into various sectors. And we then think about the productivity of the various sectors and ask whether investment ought to go in one direction rather than another. Typically, we rely on the market prices and entrepreneurs to decide how to break their investment into different categories. We don't have that privilege in our treatment of nature because much of nature is not under market supervision because property rights don't exist. Much of nature is free. Worse, we subsidize the use of nature to the tune of something like $3 to $5 trillion a year. So in other words, nature comes with a negative price. So we put even further pressure on it. Okay. So yes, it's a more complicated problem, but no, it's not an impossible problem, because if we treat nature in the way I'm suggesting in the review, we shall look for the productivity of ecosystems and then arrange investment directed at those which are most productive. Okay. And for that, you do need the expert advice of ecologists. It's not simply an entrepreneurial problem. Entrepreneurs need information about the assets on which investment is going to be, should be, or may not be put in. And for that, you need to know something about the mechanics of the asset, the processes that are guiding its productivity. For that, you need ecologists. Once you do that, these are soluble problems. We have plenty of examples of wetlands, mangroves, coral reefs, which studies of them, where you can see the gains we would have in directing investment in reviving those which have been eroded through overuse. I hope that is a partial explanation, but it was a very good question. Thank you very much.
ありがとうございます。それではですね、次にですね、経済学の観点から一つ質問をさせていただきます。で、ダスグプタ教授は長らく経済学を専門にされてきたわけですけれども、レビューではですね、経済学が信用あるものになるためには信用ある生態学の知識が必要だと、このようにおっしゃっています。で、なぜこれまで長い間経済学者は自然を見過ごすということをしてきたんでしょうか。あるいは経済というのが自然に組み込まれているという考え方はですね、これからの経済学というものにどういう影響を与えていくとお考えでしょうか。この辺お聞きしたいと思います。
There are two parts of your question, and the first part is very hard for me to answer because I'm not really a sociologist of science. I don't know how we came to miss it in our profession. I was very attracted to the subject because it seemed to me to be intriguing. I came across some very distinguished ecologists who have trained me over the past 30 years. So I've begun to appreciate the place of nature in our lives in a more scientific way than before. I think one possible reason, a nice, a friendly reading of the misuse of economics, is that much of nature is silent and she's invisible. Many of the processes that we need to understand are silent and invisible. Think of the processes under our feet in the soils, deep in the soils. Lots of things are happening there, but soil ecology is something that most of us don't even begin to learn. Okay. Farmers don't understand it either. They don't care because they have technological advances which enable them to produce a lot of food without really understanding the damage, necessarily understanding the damage they're causing on the natural processes. So silence and invisibility also means that they are missed. So it may be partly to do with that. But I wouldn't wish to go beyond that to speculate as to how our subject has ignored it. The important thing for me to express here in public is that it is not economics which is at fault. Economics is a magnificent social science. Our teachers handed over to us a brilliant grammar. The problem is we have misused it. We've misused it by ignoring this huge asset base on which our economies stand. Second part of your question about embeddedness is a really deep one, and it is important to recognize the only way to, I think I can explain it, is to go back to the received economics of climate change, which sees the conventional model of growth and distribution and poverty without any mention of climate change, any mention of nature, and thinks of economic possibilities exclusively in terms of the accumulation of produced capital and human capital. And then the economics of climate change typically builds onto it a climate model. Okay? And then sees emissions as a byproduct of output, of GDP, let us say, and that the emissions result in an additional concentration, and that concentration in the atmosphere has a negative impact on output or welfare or whatever. That's, some damage function, okay? So that you can then build the story around an additional sector which has been planted onto the conventional model, which has no nature in it. I think it has been a perfectly reasonable first move, but I think we should abandon it now. We need to abandon it because we are embedded in it. By embedded means that you really have to trace everything from source to sink. It's not simply looking at the output, but the output then has to be degraded, and that requires nature that puts stress onto nature, because when nature operates to decompose our waste, it assembles a huge amount of machinery, natural machinery. And the more waste you plant on it, the more difficult it becomes for nature to absorb it. Climate emissions is a very good example. After all, it's a biodegradable waste. Trees pick it up, plants pick it up, all right? But if you put too much pressure on it, on that process, then nature can't handle it. So we must remember that. So the model of this, the underlying model that I've given in the review looks at our human activity from top to bottom, from start to finish, from source to sink. And there, the data and ecological principles tells us that in terms of material output, there has to be a finite bound. We cannot rely, conventional models of economics think that human ingenuity, our cleverness, our brains, can overcome nature's constraints if we are smart enough by accumulating physical capital and human capital in particular, and knowledge. My review argues, and I hope you are finding persuasively, given the evidence, that indefinite increase is not possible. We have to reorient it. But when I say reorient, it's not a planning problem. We need to put prices on our activities, on the goods we use. And how it will shape up, how the composition of our output and our consumption and our demands will change if we place a price on our activities, I cannot judge. Nobody can judge. But the fact is, we need to put a price. We need to cost it. We need to be made to pay for the use of nature. I hope that's a sort of a succinct attempt at answering a very difficult question you posed. But thank you for asking it.
ありがとうございます。経済学の中ではですね、いろいろな分野で環境というものを取り入れたことが研究が増えてきておりまして、今後このダスグプタレビューに基づいたですね、いろいろな研究というのが発展していくんではないかと、このように考えております。それではですね、次にレビューでですね、非常に重要な概念として包括的富というですね概念というのを扱っておられます。で、この包括的富というのはGDP よりも、サステナビリティというのを考える上で非常に良いベンチマークになるというふうに、ダスグプタレビューではおっしゃっているわけですけれども、この包括的富というのは先ほどおっしゃったですね、資産として、生物多様性を考えるということと関連していると思いますが、もう一度この包括的富ということについて、ご説明、いただければ非常に、理解に、助かります。またですね、この政策立案者ですね、政府の政策立案者というものがこの包括的富というものを今後政策目標に取り入れていくということを促進するためには、どういうことをしていく必要があるのかということをですね、ダスグプタ教授のご見解をお聞きできればと思います。
Thank you very much. First of all, it's already happening. Several countries are now moving in the direction of creating an inventory of their capital stocks, if you like. But of course, concentration is at the moment on natural capital, in the way I've just been describing ecosystems, for example, as capital assets. So the idea is to move from flow accounts, income expenditure accounts, to capital accounts as a way of judging future possibilities that are open to an economy. So that's the first point. Secondly, Japan, your own country, has some of the finest experts on inclusive wealth. And I'll come back to the notion of inclusive wealth in a minute. Professor Managi, who is a colleague of mine, has picked it up and produced an extremely important report in 2018 with colleagues at the United Nations Environment Programme to produce the Inclusive Wealth of Nations, a cross-section study over time movements of inclusive wealth over the past 15, 20 years. From 1992 to 2010, one of their striking findings has been that per capita produced capital globally has increased by a factor of 2. Sorry, it has doubled between 1992 and 2010. Human capital has increased by about 15% during that same period, per capita human capital. But per capita natural capital has shrunk by about 40%. So that's been a sort of a dramatic way of describing what we have already discussed, which is the demand we make on nature has far exceeded nature's capacity to supply it on a sustainable basis. Inclusive wealth is simply wealth, but including natural capital, not just physical produced capital and human capital, but natural capital as well. And that's the first correction, which I make it inclusive. And the second is that, of course, since natural capital very often doesn't have any market prices, you need to estimate social prices for them. The product, in other words, try and estimate those prices on the basis of the productivity of the various forms of capital assets. This is a hard task. I'm not suggesting it's easy. And we are not going to have inclusive wealth accounts in the near future. Even if a government wants to do it, it will not be able to do it because prices are missing and there'll be lots and lots of missing items. But that shouldn't worry us because many, many things are missing in GDP estimates as well. For example, all the exchanges that take place within the household, they're not included. And it's a typical story that we tell when discussing GDP, that it misses many things. Well, you have to live in an imperfect world, that's fine. I think what will happen now is that countries will begin to have an inventory of natural capital assets. So at the end of each year, the national accounts will carry information about the state of the natural capital assets in the country's jurisdiction, so to speak, compare it with the previous year. Some will have improved, some wetlands will be healthier, some will have declined. And that's extremely important information. Of course, if you had a wealth account, you would be able to put a price on each of these. And therefore, you could then see whether wealth has increased or declined. That would be the ideal, but that may not happen for a while. But for some items, you can have prices. You can estimate prices. For example, for forests, you might use just timber as a first approximation, the timber content, and thereby say acreage, and thereby give us an idea of how much of loss to wealth has occurred by transforming forests into, say, agricultural land and so forth. Inclusive wealth, I should say, finally, this is not simply an arbitrary measure. The review proves formally, analytically, that wealth, inclusive wealth, and social well-being are deeply connected notions. If one goes up, the other goes up. If one goes down, the other goes down. So even though wealth is not the same as well-being, they move in the same direction. So any talk of sustainable development has no meaning unless we think in terms of whether inclusive wealth has gone up or down. If it has gone down, then you're not on a sustainable development path. Okay. So it's extremely important to recognize it's not just an arbitrary suggestion that the review makes. There's a deep reasoning behind the suggestion that we should move away from GDP to wealth accounts for long-term decision-making. For short-run macroeconomic management, GDP is extremely important. Goes without saying, that's why it was devised that way. It was devised for that purpose. Keynesian arithmetic demanded that. But somehow after the Second World War, GDP assumed the role of an index of welfare, but it was not meant to do that. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the simplest explanation account I can give to your question.
ありがとうございます。包括的富というのは、人々の幸せと幸福と結びついていて、で包括的富というのを上昇させるということが幸福を上昇させるということにつながるということに基づいてこれを主張されていて、その富の中に生物多様性というのが非常に重要な役割を果たしているということだと思います。ありがとうございます。包括的富というのを計測する上で、ダスグプタ教授は先ほどからもそうなんですが、価格設定という言葉を非常に多く使われています。で包括的富においてもですね、市場価格ではなく会計価格ということを使用することが主張されています。で会計価格というのを簡単に紹介していただいて、で会計価格の観点から見ると生物多様性の市場価格というのは安すぎるということになると思うのですが、この市場価格というのを会計価格に今後社会ではですね、会計価格の方向に是正していく必要があるということをおっしゃっているのでしょうか。この辺をお聞きしたいと思います。
Yes, absolutely. That's exactly what I'm suggesting. I think the best way of thinking about accounting price is to give an illustration. By the accounting price, you mean the social worth of an asset. The accounting price of an asset or an accounting price of a service is the social worth of that service. It's what it contributes to social well-being. You would mention happiness. Take a simple example. Consider a mangrove forest in an estuary. Okay, it offers certain services which we take for granted. One of them being that it provides a buffer against storms for neighboring villages which people live next to the mangrove forest. Okay, that's one. It provides some fuel wood for the inhabitants. That's another. And of course, equally important, it provides a nursery for fish. Okay. Imagine now the market price for the mangrove is zero because it's not a private your owned asset. You can still ask, what are the services that the mangrove is offering? Say the villages, the fishing industry, and so forth, by being a nursery for fisheries. Those can be monetized. What about the pressure, the protection it affords, the mangrove forest affords the villages against storms? And in Japan, that's a very reasonable question to ask. And you can determine in monetary terms, the average protection that the mangrove forest offers, even over a 10-year period, 15-year period. You have data on that kind of thing from other places. Okay, using those bits of information, you can get some idea of the social price or accounting price of the mangrove, which will of course be reflected in the inclusive wealth of the country in which the mangrove happens to be, because mangrove will be part of the natural capital system of the economy. I don't know if that makes sense, but it is true. Market prices on average are way below accounting prices. There are now tons and tons of work that has been done by environmental and resource economists over the past 20, 30 years, trying to estimate accounting prices of specific natural pieces of natural capital. And we need to build on them, collate them, and put them together in national accounts. And in the review tries to do that in a very preliminary way, of course.
ありがとうございます。市場価格で考慮されなかったような 重要な役割やサービスですね、生物多様性のそういったものもきちんと経済の中に価格として取り入れていかなければならないということになると思います。非常にそれは今後の経済社会にとって重要な動きになっていくんではないかと、このように考えます。ありがとうございます。それでは。
May I interrupt for 1 minute? I'm sorry to interrupt. I forgot to mention one thing. In a sense, we have been discussing accounting prices in the economics of climate change. When people talk about the social cost of carbon, that's an accounting price. That's exactly what it is. And the idea is to see what the damage additional emission does to economies in terms of lower output or whatever. Sorry to interrupt, but I thought I should mention the connection.
はい、ありがとうございます。二酸化炭素を排出するときは無料で排出していたわけですけれども、社会的な影響というものを考えるときには、それ価格をつけなければならないということと同じだということですね。生物多様性についても同じような考えができるということになるかと思います。ありがとうございます。それではですね、次にですね、少しビジネスのところで、お話を伺えればと思います。で、先ほど、生物多様性の損失について非常にこれは危機であるということをおっしゃっておられましたけれども、特にですね、ビジネス部門においてですね、生物多様性の損失というものがどのような危機として現れてくるのかということをですね、お聞きできればと思います。
Well, thank you very much. My review's attempt was to unify our understanding of the human economy from the level, at every level, from the household upwards to the international community, via governments, public sector, private sector, and so forth. Because so much of nature is underpriced, essentially priced at zero, people do not have the incentive to record their use. If something is free, what do you care? At the individual level, you regard it as an infinite source because you don't have to pay a price. Okay, so the intuitive notion is that for the individual level, at the level of the individual, a resource which is priced at zero is of infinite extent. So there's no need to husband it. The only reason you don't go ask for infinite amount is that harvesting cost creeps up. You don't have enough time to consume so much. So you limit it, not because the price is positive, but because you don't have the capacity to destroy it any faster. Okay? So our excess demand comes out of that fact. Now, what about companies? The fact is, of course, companies require primary products for their outputs. So take, for example, the stuff you buy in the supermarket, say coffee. Well, coffee is the finished product that you're getting. You're buying coffee beans, let us say, which you then transform in your home into drinkable coffee. Okay, but those beans come from abroad, maybe from Africa, and it's a coffee plantation. Okay, so there's a huge long supply chain of companies which have a long track across the continents. And the way biodiversity loss affects companies, as I think there's something very distinctive about the problem, arising out of the fact that the bulk of the world's biodiversity, the richest ecosystems in terms of the silent and invisible services we enjoy, are in the tropics. For example, in, say, the peatlands there, but most importantly, the rainforest, the tropical rainforests in Latin America, Africa, South Asia, and so forth. Okay, they're in the tropics. It's also the case that some of the world's poorest countries are in the tropics. Africa is a very good instance of that, an ideal instance of that, if you like, for my purposes. Okay, now, when ecosystems, the pressure is imposed on ecosystems there because of the demand by the importing country or the importing company, which is not paying all the price that needs to be paid because some of it is free, some of the sources are free, some of the services are free, then of course it impinges also on the people who live there. Now, it's a very, very important point to remember, which I think the review highlights, but I have not seen it ever discussed by the WTO, for example, the World Trade Organization, is that because so much of nature is underpriced, some of these hidden services are underpriced, poor countries, primary product producers, when they export primary products to, say, rich countries, they lose income, they lose wealth, because some of their assets are being drawn down. These hidden assets are being drawn down, which are not being priced. So the export prices are lower than the social cost of production of those primary products, which are then exported. Okay, so the market price is below, again, the social price, the accounting price. And so, which is another way of saying there's a wealth transfer from the poor countries who are exporting to the rich countries which are importing. Now that's absurd, isn't it? When you think about it, it's an outrage. But nobody's at fault here, in the sense I'm not suggesting this is capitalism gone wrong, or I'm not suggesting that there is conspiracy here. It's not that. Nobody has noticed it. In fact, primary producing countries are trying hard to expand their export in order to earn revenue, in order to invest. But notice, you're doing that by mining your natural capital, i.e. in the exporting country, and then converting it into roads, buildings, and so forth. Exactly the things that are shaping up large in the rest of the world. So what about the importing company? It faces heightened risk on their supply, in their profitability, because of the risk attached to the collapse of ecosystems from which they're importing goods. Okay, so that's the problem. The problem, however, there's one good news here, which is that the risks that these companies face, these are all importing primary products from poor countries, they're correlated. If the ecosystem from which I'm deriving the primary product starts collapsing or degrades, making my profitability lower, then that's happening also to my neighboring company, which is importing primary products from a neighboring ecosystem in that country, in that same country. So my risk is correlated with your risk if you and I happen to be competing companies. And they're correlated also with the risks that the exporters are facing. Because of course, they're sitting on that biodiversity, and if they're losing it, the profit, their income is also under threat. So there is a confluence of interest now across companies which are importing from primary products from poor countries, as well as the exporters themselves. But if you think about the importing companies, one advantage of this correlation, positive correlation, is that they have an incentive, a real interest to act collectively and ask their governments to insist that they disclose their entire conditions on their supply chain. Why? The reason is that disclosure can act as a substitute for missing markets. All these markets are missing. Part of it has to do with moral hazard. Part of it has to do with what I've been insisting on during this interview, which is that so much of nature is underpriced. But like any other collective action problem, here is one where companies do have an incentive to ask their governments to require of them to disclose. Disclosure means what? It means that they have to show how they're treating the ecosystem from which they are importing goods, so that the customer, the consumer, you and I, when we purchase our coffee, know what's happening there. And if we care about the environment, if we care about biodiversity, we mean our citizens, not the companies, the citizens, then we will insist on good practice. At the moment, we don't know what good practice means because we don't know what's happening in the supply chain. On health products, by the way, on food products, we do know. Today, all our food products have information given over its fat content, sugar content, salt content, and so forth. Why do they disclose it? They disclose it because we consumers care about our health and we insist that they disclose it. If they didn't, we wouldn't know what we're eating, and therefore there would be a market failure there. Likewise, the review is suggesting that there is now a real strong incentive on companies who are importing primary products to get together and start disclosing, but they won't do it individually necessarily. They'll need a strong arm of the government to say, no, you must do this because customers want it. And customers can, of course, urge their governments to impose such a condition. It will help the profitability of the companies themselves. That's the reason. They have an incentive to do that. I don't know if this makes sense, but it's one way of, I think, marshalling the arguments about the increasing risks that companies face as a result of biodiversity loss, because so much of our primary products are primary products, and they're using up natural capital.
ありがとうございます。今ですね、やはりこの開示の、全体としての情報の開示の必要性ということをおっしゃいました。で、今のお話にもありましたけれども、個々の生産者の立場からは、やはりこのサプライチェーンの状況を、評価したりですね、それからモニタリングを行うということは、重要だということは理解できるんですけど、各生産者の立場からはですね、なかなかそれは難しいところがあるかもしれないのですが、これを具体的にですね、実行させるためには、例えば具体的な方策としてどういったものが効果的とお考えですか。
Yes, well, as I was suggesting, this is a collective action problem. And I was suggesting that it is in the interest of the companies themselves not to individually disclose. I wasn't suggesting that, but it's in their interest to talk to each other, as it were, and then agree that it's in their collective interest, and therefore the individual interest, to disclose. But that won't necessarily happen unless they're asked to do that, or compelled to do that. And one way of doing that, of course, is the state compelling them. But why would the state wish to do that? In a democratic society, they will wish to do that only if we citizens insist that the state does that. It has happened, as I was suggesting, with food products. After all, there's a huge amount of disclosure now on food, what we eat. And that disclosure comes about because we citizens have insisted on having that done, because we need to know what we are eating. When you're buying a refrigerator, you don't need to know what's inside the refrigerator, the mechanics of it. You don't need to know the engineering. Why? The reason is that you have a notion of what is a reasonable supply, the performance of the refrigerator. And you have a contract with the seller that for the next 3 years or 4 years, there will be free service provided. If anything goes wrong with the refrigerator, they'll fix it. We don't have that here, you see. In the case of our dealings with natural capital, because if an ecosystem collapses there, we as a consumer would not know that it has, if you see what I mean. It'll only happen through the fluctuating profits of the importing country, and the risk is increasing because the threat to their sources is expanding, is accentuating. So it's not that the individual company will necessarily have an incentive to do that, although there are ethical investors, by the way. I mean, it's happening a bit. The investors, the average citizen, when he or she invests, wants to know what the company does. We are beginning to see that happening. And so there's occasional cases there that I know of where companies might say, look, others aren't doing it, but if I do it, then my reputation improves. Because I can say I'm an ethical company. I'm doing this, that, and the other to protect the biodiversity from which I'm using inputs. And there's some advantage of that, but you can't rely on that exclusively. And that's why I was suggesting that you need collective action on the part of the companies themselves. Or alternatively, the pressure could come from us as citizens. We could ask our governments to say, but look, you've got to have them disclose what they're doing because we are worried about it. We are worried about the fate of our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And we need to protect the biodiversity in the tropics. I hope that's reasonably clear.
ありがとうございます。 非常によく理解できました。特にですね、市民の立場から情報の開示を求めて、企業に対して求めていくということは、今後、非常にこれまで以上に重要性を増してくるんだということになるかと思います。ありがとうございます。それではですね、もう少し今度、ですね、今、先ほど生態系の劣化のリスクということをおっしゃっておりましたけれども、生態系のリスクに対処するために、グローバルリスクプールというのをレビューの中では提唱されています。で、この内容というものは、どのようなものか、そして保険や金融というものがこのグローバルリスクプールというものにどのように貢献できるのかということをですね、お話しいただければと思います。
Sure. Again, a wonderful question. We have in the review, of course, there is a good deal of mention of the place of insurance. One problem that we need to recognize in the case of biodiversity loss is that because nature is not only silent and invisible, it's also she is very mobile, which of course is something that we economists understand very well, because mobility means that there are these huge externalities that are transferred from one place to another. So you, let's say you dump some plastic in the Bahamas, and that same plastic is found eventually in Iceland because the ocean currents take it out there. So these externalities are rampant. Okay, but that also means that these risks are correlated because nature is interconnected, and interconnection really means correlation. If one part of the system experiences declining its productivity, then another one does so as well, because these externalities are damaging externalities. If you damage one thing, you damage something else elsewhere, and maybe sometimes in the future. It may take some time. In any case, transport takes time. So we're looking at both the spatial and a temporal dimension in these externalities. Okay. When you have correlated risk, of course, insurance is a problem. Insurance markets work very well if the risks are independent of each other. Like in accident, automobile accident, whether I'm a bad driver or a good driver or an accident takes place is independent of whether you face an accident, because it's a different situation. So on average, the insurance market can flourish because for the standard actuarial reasons, okay. The problem is if they're positively correlated, you have serious difficulty of finding insurance, because if I buy the insurance, you don't, but then your action is going to affect mine, so my probability it changes, and so it really makes it very difficult. So it can be done, of course. People do purchase insurance, but they pay a huge premium in order to go to purchase it because of these correlations. So for that reason, one of the things that we highlight in the review, I was very keen on highlighting, is that instead of thinking in terms of insurance, we should think in terms of investment in nature to keep nature from becoming unhealthy. When I say nature, I mean, of course, ecosystems, say grassland or a wetland or a mangrove forest or a coral reef, or you name it, or a forest patch. So the idea is that you don't insure because huge moral hazard issues are involved here, plus other people's activities are involved here, so as insurance markets don't work very well. So the idea would be to actually make investment in nature. And I think one of the things that we forget is that investment in nature is a lot, at least upfront investment costs are very low, upfront. Because let's say, take the extreme case, you plant a seed and initially do some watering and protecting it against, say, predators, maybe human predators, but never mind, okay? But other than that, what the investment really involves waiting. You wait for nature to grow, to get back to health, a piece of natural capital. So the incentive for doing that is low because, of course, the price is low. The market price is low, but the accounting price can be very high. And more important, the accounting price of nature relative to physical capital produced capital and human capital will be rising. Because remember, I gave you the example of the Managi finding a few minutes ago. The natural capital has been declining, whereas physical capital, produced capital has been increasing and natural capital has been increasing. In other words, the asset composition at the global level has gone in a way in which natural capital is becoming more and more scarce relative to produced capital and human capital as the years go by. Therefore, the accounting price of natural capital relative to produced capital will be increasing. So the worry that waiting is very costly because you discount something and the benefits of your investment come, planting an oak tree, let's say, the benefit comes about 50 years, 60 years from now. If you use a reasonable discount rate, the whole thing gets vanished and it's not worth it. But that's a wrong calculation because the value of the oak tree will be increasing over time because of the argument I've just now given you. Therefore, the discount rate that you might be using, should be ideally the accounting discount rate, may be negative, not positive, negative, because it's becoming more and more valuable. Okay. So there are good things ahead of us if we think logically. Economics, as I said, is a very powerful language to use. When applied to nature, we misuse it. So I've been very concerned while writing the review in clearing up these possible objections, saying that it's all very well for you to say you invest in nature, but what's the payoff? What's the profitability? By the way, I used to be asked this question of my colleagues in the Indian government when I was writing a report for the Indian government on India's national accounts and suggesting that they move to an inclusive wealth framework. That was submitted in 2013. My old friends of mine who are now big shots in the government at that time, chief secretaries would say, Panapatha, it's all very well, but we have to worry about the bottom line. And the bottom line says that nature is not much product, the payoff from investing in nature is rather low. And no environmentalist explains to me why I shouldn't invest in nature. And I had to use these arguments. And I put them together. So I would say I wouldn't rely that much on insurance markets, but on investment. That's the best kind of insurance because it's insuring against the ecosystem having a breakdown. Whereas normal insurance would say, if it has a breakdown, I want to be compensated because I've paid for its possible breakdown. And that change, I think, from one system of thought to another, I think is extremely important.
ありがとうございます。今の投資がですね、自然に対する投資が非常に重要だということに沿ってですね、もう一つお聞きしたいと思います。で民間企業が投資するときには当然資金調達というのをしていかなければならないわけですが、これまで市場経済では、投資家のマネーというのは安全で収益率の高いところに集まってきました。安全性が高くですね、リターンが高いところというところに集まってきたんですが、これからこのマネーの流れというものを自然に対する投資あるいは生物多様性保全というものに集めるためには金融部門というのをどういうふうに変えていく必要があるんでしょうか。
Well, very difficult question to answer, and you would be much better. People who are listening to this program would be far greater experts than I on this matter. I do see the problem very deeply, largely because it's market prices which rule the investment strategies, not accounting prices. So far, we've talked about accounting prices, but if they're not there on the table, how do you do that? I've also tried to give an idea that maybe it's in the interest of the financial sector, the importing countries, companies to collude, to disclose and so forth. But okay, leave that aside now. It seems to me a great deal of weight on this problem is going to have to be borne by government. One way they can do it, as the UK is beginning to think in terms of, is to issue green bonds. So that's a guarantee that the investment is going to go towards nature protection and so forth. So the burden of that investment is taken up by an assurance by the state that such investment will take place. In other words, that's a way of introducing accounting prices. Ideally, that's the way of introducing accounting prices in investment decisions, as opposed to market prices, or rather add accounting prices to many of the goods and services that are in the investment outlay, which are where the market prices are way off. So remember, the idea is to know what you want to see happen and then work backwards to find a way for that to happen. Okay, it's not a question of first finding out because Das Gupta is saying there ought to be green bonds. It's a good idea to have green bonds, that we should have green bonds. The question is, why do we need green bonds? The reason that we do is that you don't have the incentive in the marketplace for doing that. So some kind of a guarantee that the returns will be financial returns to the investor buying stocks, shares, in this case, bonds. And that guarantee can only come from the state, because to the extent that the companies the private companies will not acknowledge accounting prices. Okay, so we've gone through now a sequence of examples in this interview, and I'm grateful to you for asking these very important questions, where I've shown to the extent that there are incentives inbuilt in the problem for the private sector to take action. And then the latest question you've asked is one where you're saying, no, but it's not going to close the gap. You need something more. And I think in this case, it is very much the state. Now, this is not new in one sense. It's not new because when I was growing up back in the 50s and 60s, 1960s, the state was extremely important in pretty much all at least certainly in India. And my guess is, I don't know about Japan, certainly in India, it was extremely important for the state to enter into certain types of investment activity. In those days, it used to be heavy capital goods sector. The argument was that the private sector does not have the, at least in the Indian context, there was a thought that they could not be relied upon to invest sufficiently on infrastructure, for example. That has to be in the roads and so forth, dams. These are the projects that the government is supposed to do. Why? Same reason, that the profitability would be too low, particularly given the investment outlay for the private sector. So the idea that the state gets engaged in some investment or redirects investment in a particular way through clever means is nothing new. It's just that it's never been deployed for protecting Mother Nature. And what the review does is to try and find ways by which that can happen.
ありがとうございます。グリーンボンドはイギリスで、販売されたときに非常に人気が高かったということをお聞きしていますが、今後我々、機関投資家だけではなくて個人としてもですね、そうした、投資行動の中で生物多様性に配慮するようなポートフォリオというものを選択していく、必要があるんではないかなということを今、ダスグプタ先生のお話を聞いて、理解した次第です。またその上で政府というものが国家というものが非常にですねそうした仕組みというものを我々に提供してくれるということが重要になるんではないかとこのように思います。さて、ダスグプタレビューの中ではですねエコロジカルフットプリントを表す式というものが非常に多く出てきています。で、その中のいわゆるダスグプタレビューで使われているアルファという記号はですねテクノロジーを表していると見られますけれども、気候変動ではですねさまざまなテクノロジーが緩和と適応に大きな貢献を行っていますけれども、生物多様性の損失の危機においてテクノロジーというものがどの程度役立つと考えられるでしょうか。
Thank you very much. Yes, there is a partial place for technology. One of the things that the review does is to argue, I hope with evidence and reason, that we should shy away from thinking that technology will be the savior of the day. That has been a big mistake, and it was transported, as I was suggesting earlier, into the received economics of climate change. And I think that has been a bit unfortunate, because it so happened that in the case of climate change, there is a viable, potentially a viable technology which is clean. You see what I mean? Wind and solar and so forth. But we should be under no illusion that technology is there available for reducing this problem. There are some areas, of course, biotechnology is one. If you can genetically modified crops is one, which is another way of increasing alpha. You need less land, let us say, to produce the food that you need and so forth. So you need less encroachment on natural capital. The tension that we've had, you were asking about the impact equation, that is our demand ecological footprint. One way of thinking about the problem, and that's how we begin in the review, is to look at the demands humanity makes on nature's goods and services on an annual basis, let us say, and nature's ability to supply them on a sustainable basis. And currently, it's the gap between the demand and supply is huge. The ratio of demand to supply has been estimated, at least by one reasonably, as the best estimate that I can think of, is about 1.6 or 1.7, which gives length to the metaphor that we need 1.6 Earths to satisfy our needs. That's one way of expressing it. And the reason I began with the impact equation is that the inequality, that is the demand and the supply, and the fact that demand exceeds the supply, is that we are in a firefighting situation globally. So it's part of inclusive wealth, of course, because demand exceeding supply means that nature is depleting. And that bit of nature, that is nature as a capital asset, that this impact inequality, the demand and supply gap, will be reflected in the inclusive wealth changes. Because if the impact inequality is very large, then the gap is very large, then of course wealth, that part of the component of wealth, which is natural capital, will be declining at a fast rate. So inclusive wealth is related to this, but the impact inequality is extremely important because that lends us attention to it. Now, what I did was to decompose the demand into, as you say, alpha, the technology factor, the efficiency with which we convert nature's goods and services into final products, and also recognizing that the demand depends on our final products, which is GDP. So globally, it's population times average GDP divided by alpha, which is the demand. That's the way I've decomposed it. You could decompose it in other ways, but this decomposition tells us which are the parameters which are affecting our demand and supply of nature's goods and services. And on the right-hand side is, of course, nature's ability to regenerate itself, okay? So the right-hand side is about investment. The supply side is to be met by investment in it, and the demand side has to be done by either reducing our global GDP or increasing the efficiency by which we transform. And that efficiency, we can do some things. As I said, biotechnology is one, and there are other things we can do, many things, by reviving ecosystems and so forth. But on the whole, I think it's a mistake to think that alpha, the efficiency parameter, is the way to go. Because we've tried over and over again technological solutions, and the problem is Mother Nature is so intricate, so mysterious, that you try and solve one problem and 5 other problems show up without you not anticipating it. It's like, you're creating you plug one hole and another hole starts in the bathtub because you don't know how the bathtub reacts to your activities. So I'm very conservative at the moment on the idea that we can find technological solutions to the dilemma that we have created about our place in our nature.
ありがとうございます。非常にテクノロジーの重要性とそれから限界というものが生物多様性の面でよく理解できました。さて、 ダスグプタレビューはイギリスの財務省から以前発行されたスターンレビューが、地球温暖化の、国際的な政策に影響を与えたように、今後、世界のですね、生物多様性の保全の、政策、あるいはビジネス部門での、生物多様性面との関わりというものに大きく影響を与えると、このように考えられています。多くの国の環境政策というものの重要な柱というのは、この気候変動問題と生物多様性の問題ということになると思いますけれども、この気候変動問題とそれから生物多様性の問題というのはよく切り離されて、考えられているということが多くございます。でしかしですね、レビューでは両者の問題には関係している点も少なくないということが書かれています。で生物多様性保全と気候変動の問題というのはどういうところで関連し、でどういうふうに共通して今後取り組んでいけばいいのかということをお聞きしたいと思います。
Thank you very much. I can be very brief. There is a deep connection, of course, because of the reason I mentioned previously, that nature's services are interrelated with one another. You can't break them up into separate ones. Each affects the others. So in the case of climate change, we can see immediately that climate extreme events and so forth alters the composition of the biosphere. All right. Drier weather, for example, in some parts is going to convert forests into grasslands in due course. So the biodiversity impact of climate change on biodiversity, the spread of biodiversity, or the state, in this case, the state of ecosystems is clear enough. The reverse holds. If you cut down the rainforest, then it's going to change the wind patterns. And if nothing else, the ability to absorb carbon will be declining. Forests will become net emitters, not net absorbers. And so the direction of influence goes the other way as well. So yes, these are extremely connected problems. And in fact, in some ways, as I was arguing before, it is a mistake to isolate one of them from the other because they're related. And I think the right way to do it is to think, as I was suggesting, is to think of nature as a capital asset, the biosphere as a capital asset, and all the ecosystems as sub-assets, if you like. That's the natural capital sector, if you like, as opposed to the manufacturing sector, the industrial sector, and so forth, as we are familiar with, or the agricultural sector. We should be thinking in terms of the biosphere as a sector supplying us with goods and services that we enjoy.
ありがとうございます。今後の環境政策で非常に注意して、留意してですね、いかなければならないところだと思います。決していわゆる縦割りといったような政策の、取り組み方というのは行わないでいくということが必要なんではないかと思います。それではですね、先ほど申し上げましたように、今日の、この懇談会ではですね、ビジネス部門の方が多く聞かれています。でダスグプタ教授がですね、このレビューの中で取り上げた問題に対してですね、日本の企業あるいは先進国の企業に、どういうアクションというのを期待されるでしょうか。このことについて最後にお聞きできればと思います。
Okay, my greatest hope is something that's not going to happen. It's a wish list, as it were, but it's such a simple wish list, part of the wish list, that I should mention it. Ideally, I would like to see our leaders, global leaders today, be as bold as the global leaders were at the end of the Second World War, when the countries in the Far East were on their knees. Europe was on its knees because it had been shattered by the war. But what happened? There was a Marshall Plan. There was huge determination of populations in the Far East to improve themselves, and there's sacrifices they made to to raise their economies through discipline and so forth. That's all there. But also, simultaneously, our world leaders created the World Bank and the IMF. Now, why did they do that? The idea was that there were certain global public goods which needed to be serviced, had to be supplied, but wouldn't happen otherwise without an international institution. So the World Bank was there to help development and reconstruction. Okay, and IMF was there to provide the global public good of financial stability of nations. And that cost money. We should now have something similar, but with a wider reach to manage the global commons, for example, the open oceans. We're not paying the price, any price, the accounting price or the accounting rent that the fee that we ought to be charged for shipping goods across the Pacific, across the Atlantic, across the Indian Ocean, all these oceans. Nobody pays any prices. You pay some port charges when you arrive at a country, but that's quite different. We're talking now about the fact that you're using the ocean for fishing, among one thing, and this huge transportation of trillions of dollars of goods that are shipped, oil tankers, the carriers of heavy-duty material and so forth. All that's happening, and that's encroaching on the oceans, which is an extremely important biome. It's one of the biggest capital assets we have, because without the oceans, without life in the oceans, we are dead, absolutely dead. And it's not in infinite supply, it's in finite supply, because the pressure on the oceans is huge now. Not just as a place where you dump your plastic and your effluent. That's one thing. The other is, of course, the use that we actually make in this transportation. We ought to be paying a price for it. And who can monitor it? Who can administer it? It can't be any particular nation, because the oceans are open. They're common resources. Nobody owns it. So we need to do that. And one of the suggestions was, not only can we should do that and then collect a rent, which can generate billions of dollars a year, a price that we ought to be paying for using it, by the way. So it's not a question of taxing income. It's really it's a price for a good that we use. Okay, that money could be used to compensate or pay countries in the tropics which house some of the greatest rainforests. Brazil is one of the countries, for example. They can legitimately say, we house these rainforests, they're providing a service to everybody else, but why should we necessarily be responsible for protecting them? Now, you may not agree with that argument, but the fact is that they are actually now deforesting like crazy. Malaysia is doing the same thing, Indonesia is doing the same thing, it's converted into plantations. We should be paying money to them as a way of ensuring that they do not then do that. They need compensation. It's called payment for ecosystem services, which many countries are adopting now. I believe Japan too. China does, Costa Rica does, England does. It's payment for ecosystem services. One party pays another party for the services that the other party's ecosystem is offering the party who is making the payment. We should do that. And we can easily afford to pay, because we can charge the rents for using the global commons. Nothing like that is on the table. So that's the one thing I would really like to see happen. At least the review opens up that for discourse. And I think it may take time. Everybody will say there are problems with it. Of course, there's a problem with it. People were arguing against the IMF too, presumably in 1948 or so, whenever it was. But we have to do that. A rational world would take economics seriously and say, yes, here are these major public goods, global public goods, and they're being trashed because we don't charge for them. So that's one thing I would like to see happen. I should say another thing, a final point. When I was talking about the role of the state in managing investment, as I was suggesting, I also had in mind not just the national governments, but local communities, local governments. In the UK, for example, local councils and village councils are responsible for looking after the common property resource, like the park. Each village has a park. We call it commons. Okay, so like a park. It's a field where people can play football or cricket and so forth, and children's playground. Those are very interesting developments. They have been always there, but now they're becoming greener in some ways. and making those richer in biodiversity. These moves need to come from the local authorities, if you like, collective action at the local level. So the review talks in terms of collective action, starting from the local level, village level, up to the international level. And I began with the example of the international level, where we really could do with a international movement in creating an institution, given the power to set charges and monitor and invest also, reinvest in natural capital.
ありがとうございます。今日はダスグプタレビューの枠組み、それから個々のですね、アクターのこれからの今後すべき行動、それから政府、自治体、こうした主体というものが努力しなければならない方向性というものを合わせてさまざまお聞きすることができました。生物多様性の問題は非常に複雑な、おっしゃっているように複雑な問題だと思いますけれども、複雑だからこそいろいろなソリューションや、それから工夫のしがいというものがヒントとして隠れているものなのではないかなと、このように考えます。で、そうした工夫というものを見つける上でですね、研究者、それから企業、それから消費者というものが合わせてですね、共同していく必要があるのではないかと、今日のお話を聞いて思いました。今日は本当に有意義なお話をありがとうございました。非常に我々にとって刺激的で、かつ今後の方向性に有用なお話でありました。改めてお礼申し上げます。Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your impressive talk.
Welcome. You're most welcome. It was a pleasure meeting you again, and the incisive questions you've asked. It was a pleasure to have this discussion with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. それでは長谷川さんにお返しします。
はい、ダスグプタ名誉教授、大沼教授、大変どうもありがとうございました。時間を超えまして具体例を交えながらですね、大変分かりやすいご説明をいただいたと思います。おかげさまでダスグプタレビューに対する我々の理解を大いに深めることができたというふうに考えております。オンラインのウェビナーではございますけれども、拍手をもって両教授に感謝の意を表したいと思います。
Thank you very much.
またご登壇いただきましたロングボトム大使、英国財務省のブリットン様、環境省の奥田局長に改めて御礼申し上げます。なお、チャットにですね、ご質問いただいてたようなんですけれども、ちょっと時間の関係でご紹介することができませんでした。この場を借りてお詫び申し上げます。本日のウェビナーは以上となります。この後、簡単なアンケートをメールでお送りしたいと思いますので、皆様の忌憚のないご意見をいただければと思います。本日はご参加いただきまして、誠にありがとうございました。